The pickup truck exploded at exactly 9:17 a.m. on November 4, 1955, sending pieces of Willie Bioff across a Phoenix parking lot like confetti at a particularly grim celebration. The blast was heard 3 blocks away, rattling windows and setting car alarms wailing across the desert city. When the smoke cleared, there wasn't enough left of William Nelson, as Bioff had been calling himself, to fill a briefcase. But there was enough left to send a message that echoed from Arizona all the way back to the marble corridors of power in Hollywood and Chicago. 3 days later, Johnny Rosselli stood at the back of the funeral service at Desert Lawn Cemetery, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair gleaming in the harsh Arizona sun, looking every inch the successful businessman he pretended to be. To the other mourners, he appeared to be just another associate of the deceased, perhaps a business partner or old friend. They had no idea they were looking at the man who had orchestrated Willie Bioff's death, or that this moment would unravel the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in American history. As the preacher droned on about forgiveness and eternal peace, Rosselli's mind drifted back 10 years, to another funeral, another time when death had seemed like justice. Because Willie Bioff hadn't just been any mob associate. He had been the rat who destroyed Johnny Rosselli's Hollywood empire, the stool pigeon whose testimony had sent Rosselli and half the Chicago outfit to federal prison. And now, finally, after a decade of careful planning and patient hunting, the debt was paid. But Johnny Rosselli had made a crucial mistake that November morning in 1955. He thought Willie Bioff's death would bury the past. Instead, it was about to dig up secrets that would expose the greatest criminal conspiracy Hollywood had ever seen, revealing how the mob had systematically looted millions from the Dream Factory and corrupted an entire industry. What Rosselli didn't know was that the FBI had been watching him since the moment the truck exploded, and they were about to connect dots that would destroy not just Rosselli, but everyone who had profited from the blood money of Tinseltown. The story really began in 1934, when the Chicago outfit realized they were sitting on the greatest extortion opportunity in American history. Hollywood was a gold mine, but it was a gold mine protected by unions, and unions could be bought, threatened, or simply taken over. All it required was the right man for the job, someone sophisticated enough to move in Hollywood circles, ruthless enough to enforce the outfit's will, and smart enough to make it all look legitimate. Johnny Rosselli was that man. At 29, he had already established himself as Capone's most effective West Coast operator, a gentleman gangster who could discuss film budgets over lunch and order executions over dinner. He had the charm to seduce starlets and the intelligence to understand complex financial structures. Most importantly, he had something most mobsters lacked: vision. While other gangsters saw Hollywood as just another territory to control, Rosselli saw it as an industry to own. The plan was breathtakingly simple and devastatingly effective. The Chicago outfit would take control of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, the union that represented every behind-the-scenes worker in Hollywood. Once they controlled the union, they could shut down any studio at will. And once they could shut down studios, they could charge studios millions of dollars for the privilege of continuing to make movies. It was extortion on an industrial scale, and it required industrial-scale organization. That's where Willie Bioff came in. Bioff was a former pimp and small-time criminal who had somehow worked his way into the IATSE hierarchy through a combination of violence, bribes, and sheer audacity. He was crude, loud, and obvious, everything Johnny Rosselli was not, but he was also completely controllable, which made him perfect for the outfit's purposes. The Chicago bosses would pull the strings, Rosselli would coordinate operations from Los Angeles, and Bioff would be the public face of their Hollywood takeover. But what none of them anticipated was how personal this would become, how the millions in extorted money would corrupt not just studios and unions, but the very men who were supposed to control the operation, how greed and ego would turn allies into enemies, and how one man's moment of conscience would bring down an empire that had taken years to build. By 1937, the Hollywood extortion machine was generating more money than anyone had imagined possible. Major studios like MGM, Paramount, and Warner Brothers were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to avoid labor disputes that never materialized but always threatened. Smaller studios paid smaller amounts, but even those modest payments represented fortunes by 1930 standards. The money flowed from Hollywood to Chicago like a river of gold, with Johnny Rosselli taking his cut at every level. Rosselli had positioned himself perfectly within this system. Officially, he was an associate producer at several studios and a labor relations consultant. Unofficially, he was the man studio heads called when they needed problems solved, whether those problems involved union disputes, difficult stars, or inconvenient investigations. He lived in a mansion in Beverly Hills, drove a custom Cadillac, and carried business cards that read simply John Rosselli, executive. No one who met him would have guessed that he was orchestrating the systematic robbery of an entire industry. The genius of the operation lay in its apparent legitimacy. Studio executives could convince themselves they were simply paying for labor peace, not funding organized crime. Union leaders could pretend they were negotiating in good faith, not implementing extortion schemes. And Rosselli could maintain his facade as a successful businessman while secretly funneling millions to his Chicago bosses. Everyone involved had plausible deniability, which made everyone complicit in maintaining the fiction. But Willie Bioff was becoming a problem. The success of the Hollywood operation had gone to his head, and he was starting to believe his own publicity. He bought an 80-acre ranch, threw lavish parties, and began acting like a legitimate labor leader rather than a mob frontman. Worse, he was attracting attention from journalists and federal investigators who were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about his background and sudden wealth. Rosselli warned Bioff repeatedly to keep a lower profile, but Bioff was drunk on power and money. The beginning of the end came in 1939, when syndicated columnist Westbrook Pegler published a series of articles exposing Bioff's criminal background and questioning his rapid rise within IATSE. Pegler revealed that Bioff had been convicted of pandering in Chicago and had served only 6 months of what should have been a much longer sentence. More damaging, Pegler began investigating the union's finances and the unusual labor peace that had settled over Hollywood. The spotlight that Rosselli had worked so hard to avoid was now shining directly on their operation. Still, they might have weathered the publicity if not for a single moment of corporate conscience. Joseph Schenck, president of United Artists, was called before a federal grand jury investigating tax evasion in the film industry. Instead of lying or taking the Fifth Amendment, Schenck made a decision that would destroy the entire extortion network. He told the truth. He admitted to paying Willie Bioff substantial sums in exchange for labor peace. He provided details about meetings, amounts, and methods. In effect, he confessed to being the victim of a massive extortion scheme. Schenck's testimony opened floodgates that couldn't be closed. Other studio executives, faced with the choice between admitting they had been extorted or being charged as co-conspirators, began cooperating with federal investigators. The carefully constructed fiction of legitimate labor relations crumbled as executive after executive described the same pattern of threats, payments, and protection. By 1941, the federal government had built an airtight case against Bioff, his associate George Brown, and the Chicago bosses who controlled them. The trial began in 1942. And it was a sensation. For the first time, the American public got a detailed look at how organized crime had infiltrated legitimate business. Newspaper headlines screamed about mob-controlled unions and Hollywood racketeers. Testimony revealed the staggering amounts of money involved, over $2 million in direct extortion payments, with millions more in lost productivity and inflated costs. The trial exposed not just a criminal conspiracy, but a systematic corruption of American capitalism. Johnny Rosselli sat in the defendant's chair throughout the proceedings, maintaining his composure even as witness after witness described his central role in the operation. He listened as studio executives explained how they had been forced to pay tribute to avoid labor disputes. He watched as federal prosecutors presented evidence of his meetings, his financial arrangements, and his threats. Through it all, he remained the perfect gentleman, dressed in expensive suits, polite to court officers, and unfailingly courteous to prosecutors who were trying to destroy his life. But behind that facade, Rosselli was calculating. He knew the government's case was overwhelming. He knew that conviction was virtually certain. What he didn't know was whether his Chicago bosses would stand by him or eliminate him to protect themselves. He also didn't know that Willie Bioff, facing decades in federal prison, was about to make the decision that would save his own life and doom everyone else involved in the conspiracy. The betrayal came without warning. One morning in early 1943, Willie Bioff's attorney announced that his client was prepared to cooperate fully with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. Bioff would provide complete details about the Hollywood extortion scheme, including names, dates, amounts, and methods. He would testify against his former associates, including Johnny Rosselli and the Chicago bosses who had controlled the operation. In effect, Willie Bioff was about to become the most damaging informant in the history of organized crime. The impact was immediate and devastating. Bioff's testimony provided prosecutors with inside details they never could have obtained otherwise. He explained how the conspiracy had been organized, how money had been laundered, and how threats had been enforced. He named names, described meetings, and provided documentation that corroborated years of investigation. His cooperation turned an already strong case into an unstoppable steamroller that crushed everyone in its path. For Johnny Rosselli, Bioff's betrayal was more than just a legal catastrophe. It was a personal humiliation. Rosselli had spent years cultivating an image of sophistication and respectability. He had been welcomed in the best Hollywood society, trusted by studio executives and respected by criminal associates. Now he was revealed as nothing more than a glorified extortionist, his carefully constructed facade stripped away by the testimony of a former pimp who couldn't keep his mouth shut. The convictions came in late 1943. Johnny Rosselli was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. The Chicago bosses received similar sentences. Willie Bioff, in exchange for his cooperation, received a reduced sentence and was released after serving less than 4 years. By 1944, the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in Hollywood history had been completely dismantled, its leaders scattered to federal prisons across the country, its vast financial network seized by federal authorities. But prison sentences and financial losses were only the beginning of the consequences. The real damage was to reputation and relationships within organized crime. Johnny Rosselli had built his career on being trusted by both legitimate businessmen and criminal associates. Now he was known as the man who had been brought down by a rat, his operation exposed by someone he should have controlled. In the unforgiving world of organized crime, that kind of failure carried a death sentence that no federal judge could impose or commute. Rosselli served 3 years of his 10-year sentence, released in 1947 on parole due to overcrowding and good behavior. He returned to a Hollywood that had moved on without him, an industry that now had federal oversight of its labor relations and studio executives who wanted nothing to do with anyone connected to the extortion scandal. His old associates were either dead, in prison, or unwilling to be seen with him. His sources of income had evaporated, his reputation was destroyed, and his future in organized crime was uncertain at best. That's when Rosselli made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of fading into obscurity or attempting to rebuild his Hollywood empire, he would hunt down Willie Bioff and settle the debt that had been accumulating interest for over a decade. It wouldn't be enough to simply have Bioff killed. Any competent hitman could arrange that. Rosselli wanted Bioff to know who was coming for him and why. He wanted the death to be public, spectacular, and unmistakably connected to the betrayal that had destroyed the Chicago outfit's Hollywood operation. Finding Bioff proved more difficult than killing him would be. The federal government had relocated their star witness under an assumed identity, providing him with new documents and a modest income in exchange for his silence about ongoing investigations. Bioff had become William Nelson, a small-time businessman in Phoenix, Arizona, living quietly with his wife and trying to forget his past. He had plastic surgery to alter his appearance, avoided contact with anyone from his criminal days, and carefully maintained the fiction of being a legitimate citizen with no connection to organized crime. But Rosselli had resources that the federal government didn't fully understand. He had contacts throughout law enforcement, relationships with private investigators, and access to information that official agencies couldn't obtain. More importantly, he had patience. He was willing to spend years tracking down a single target, building a network of informants and observers who could monitor Bioff's activities without triggering federal protection protocols. By 1954, Rosselli knew exactly where Willie Bioff was living, what he was doing, and how he could be reached. The final phase of Rosselli's revenge began in early 1955, when he traveled to Phoenix under his own assumed identity. He posed as a business investor interested in local real estate, renting an apartment, opening a bank account, and establishing the kind of paper trail that would provide cover for an extended surveillance operation. For months he watched Bioff's routine, learning his habits, identifying vulnerabilities, and planning an execution that would send the right message to anyone tempted to cooperate with federal authorities. The car bomb was almost an afterthought, a signature that would ensure everyone understood who was responsible and why. Rosselli could have arranged a shooting, a poisoning, or any number of methods that would have been quieter and less conspicuous. But he wanted noise. He wanted attention. He wanted the death to be unmistakably connected to organized crime, a public reminder that betraying the mob carried consequences that federal protection couldn't prevent. On the morning of November 4, 1955, Willie Bioff walked to his pickup truck in the parking lot behind his Phoenix office building, inserted the key in the ignition, and triggered the explosive device that Johnny Rosselli had spent months planning and positioning. The blast was heard for miles, creating a fireball that consumed not just Bioff but the vehicle and everything around it. Police found pieces of the truck embedded in buildings 3 blocks away, They found pieces of Willie Bioff scattered across an even wider area. 3 days later, at the funeral service that would be Willie Bioff's last public appearance, Johnny Rosselli stood among the mourners with the satisfaction of a man who had finally balanced a very old set of books. He had waited 11 years for this moment, planned it for 2 years, and executed it with the precision that had made him one of the most feared men in organized crime. Justice, as Rosselli understood it, had finally been served. But Rosselli's moment of triumph contained the seeds of his ultimate destruction. Federal investigators had been monitoring organized crime activities in Phoenix since Bioff's relocation, and they had observed the unusual presence of out-of-town visitors in the weeks leading up to the bombing. More importantly, they had photographed everyone who attended the funeral, including the well-dressed stranger who seemed oddly pleased by the proceedings. Within weeks of Willie Bioff's death, Johnny Rosselli was identified as the primary suspect in a federal murder investigation that would consume the rest of his life. The investigation that followed Willie Bioff's assassination became a template for how federal authorities would pursue organized crime for the next 2 decades. Instead of focusing solely on the specific crime, investigators used the murder as a starting point for examining Rosselli's entire criminal career. They reopened files from the Hollywood extortion case, re-interviewed witnesses from the 1940s trials, and began building a comprehensive picture of how organized crime had evolved since the original prosecutions. What they discovered was that the Hollywood extortion scandal had been just the beginning. While serving his reduced prison sentence, Rosselli had used his time to plan an even more ambitious criminal enterprise centered on Las Vegas rather than Hollywood. He had emerged from prison not as a defeated criminal, but as a more sophisticated operator with a better understanding of how to avoid federal prosecution. The death of Willie Bioff wasn't just revenge. It was a message to anyone who might consider cooperating with federal authorities in future investigations. But the message backfired spectacularly. Instead of deterring cooperation, Willie Bioff's assassination convinced federal authorities that organized crime represented a far more serious threat than they had previously understood. The willingness to execute a protected witness demonstrated a level of sophistication and ruthlessness that demanded a comprehensive federal response. By killing Willie Bioff, Johnny Rosselli had inadvertently triggered the most intensive organized crime investigation in American history. The irony was perfect and devastating. The man who had built his career on being smarter than his enemies, more sophisticated than his associates, and more careful than his predecessors, had made the one mistake that would destroy everything he had worked to rebuild. In trying to bury the past, he had dug up a future that would prove even more dangerous. Willie Bioff was dead, but his ghost would haunt Johnny Rosselli for the next 20 years, until another funeral, Rosselli's own, would finally close the books on the bloodiest chapter in Hollywood's criminal history. The investigation continued for years, eventually connecting Rosselli to activities far beyond the original Hollywood extortion scheme. Federal authorities discovered his involvement in Las Vegas casino operations, his relationships with CIA assassination plots, and his connections to some of the most significant criminal enterprises of the 20th century. The trail that began with Willie Bioff's exploding pickup truck eventually led investigators all the way to the Kennedy assassination, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and conspiracy theories that persist to this day. In 1976, Johnny Rosselli's own body was found floating in a 55-gallon drum in Dumfoundling Bay near Miami, the victim of an assassination that mirrored Willie Bioff's in its brutality and symbolic value. The man who had lived by orchestrating spectacular deaths had died in equally spectacular fashion, his murder as carefully planned and precisely executed as any he had ordered. The wheel had come full circle, from one funeral to another, spanning 2 decades of violence, betrayal, and revenge that had reshaped both organized crime and federal law enforcement. The funeral that started a war had finally ended with another funeral that closed it. Willie Bioff's death in 1955 marked the beginning of the modern era of federal organized crime prosecution. Johnny Rosselli's death in 1976 marked the end of the generation of sophisticated criminals who thought they could operate with impunity in the shadows of legitimate business. Between those 2 moments, American law enforcement had been transformed from a collection of local agencies into a coordinated federal force capable of pursuing complex criminal enterprises across state lines and decades of careful planning. Today, both men are remembered primarily for how they died rather than how they lived. Willie Bioff is the informant who was blown up in a parking lot, a cautionary tale about the dangers of cooperating with federal authorities. Johnny Rosselli is the gentleman gangster who ended up in a barrel, a reminder that even the most sophisticated criminals eventually face consequences for their choices. But their real legacy lies in what their deaths revealed about the hidden connections between organized crime, legitimate business, and federal power connections that continue to shape American society in ways that most people never recognize or understand. The funeral that Johnny Rosselli attended with such satisfaction in 1955 had indeed started a war, but it was a war that Rosselli ultimately lost, despite winning every battle for 20 years. His smile at Willie Bioff's graveside was the expression of a man who thought he had buried his past, not realizing he had actually excavated his future. In the end, both men became victims of the same system they had tried to exploit, a system where betrayal and revenge created cycles of violence that consumed everyone involved, no matter how clever they thought they were.